this is it's entitled "It Wasn't Me," and if you have heard this song, this is by Shaggy, and the idea behind the song is that people are finding dead bodies and other things, crimes that were committed, and the kind of the echo chorus in there is always "It wasn't me, it wasn't me," and so that's kind of the basis for this study. And we're going to look at a few verses in Romans. And the reason is that I'm reading through Romans right now, and I always enjoy Romans. I find that I find learn all sorts of new things every time I go through it. And on these particular verses we're going to look at are ones that I've brought up before, and there's a lot in them. You can pull a lot of different things out, and I've pulled different things out before and showed you those before. I'm going to pull out another thing that you might not have seen yourselves, and we'll look at that again. And that's the idea of "it wasn't me, I didn't do that." And so these verses start at Romans 7:14, and there's only like about 10 or something of them that we're going to look at here. And this is Paul writing in Romans, obviously, and he's this is all part of a much larger discourse, but we're just going to take these few verses out of that. And so he begins by saying, "For we know that the law, the Torah, is spiritual, but I am carnal, and I am sold to sin." Now, that idea of "I am sold to sin," this is Paul, an apostle, saying, "I am sold to sin." And he's going to explain what he means by that, but that might shock us at first. And he says, For that which I committed, I did not understand, neither was it anything that I chose, but I was doing what I hated." Now, he's referring back to before he was a Christian. He was living like a Jew, and he was concerned to do everything right that was in the law. And he was trying to do that, but he realized that he couldn't do that. He says, "For that which I committed, I did not understand, neither was it anything that I chose, but I was doing what I hated." And so he says that he finds in the Old Covenant, it wasn't possible for him to do everything that he wanted. Instead of doing the things that he wanted to do, he did things that he didn't want to do, and he didn't understand why that was. It seemed odd to him that he couldn't obey God's laws, and despite his every effort to try and do what was right, he kept finding that it wasn't possible for him to do that. And so verse 16 continues on, and it says, "And if I did what I did not choose, I testify of the law that it is excellent." So he's saying, if I tried to do these things right, and instead I did the things that I didn't want to, the things I didn't choose to do, I was doing those instead. He says that shows that the law is excellent. And so he's saying that the law, which he said earlier was spiritual, and because he's physical, he's unable to do that. He's unable to live to that standard in the law. So he's introducing an idea that he's going to continue on with in a moment here, that there are two laws in the Old Covenant. And the Torah is the one that he is talking about here first, and he calls it spiritual, and he says the Torah speaks to the spiritual man. That's what it was about. But he says there's also a carnal law that he has to deal with, and he says the law is excellent, but I was just not able to do it all the time. He says I tried, and most of the time I could do it, but I couldn't always do it. And he says he didn't understand why. He didn't choose to do the things that were wrong, but he kept on doing them anyway. And he said, I hated doing those things, but those were the things that I kept doing, and I couldn't stop myself. And so he says the written law could only pronounce, well, he didn't say that here, but that is something we'll see here later on. The written law can only pronounce a sentence of death on a person. It can only say, you sinned, and therefore you are separated from God, and the sentence for that is death. And so law was very limited in what it could do. It could show you what was wrong, and if you kept from doing that, then that was good. But he says, Paul, I couldn't keep from doing the things that were wrong, and I kept doing them anyway. And so, continuing on to the next verses, we're going to see here that Paul, who has been talking about his life under Judaism, is now going to start talking about his present life, and he says, now I understand. But now it is not I who am committing this, but sin that dwells within me. For I know that good does not dwell within me, within my flesh. For it is easy for me to delight in the good, but I am unable to perform it. It was not the good that I wanted that I did, but the evil that I did not want to do that I did. So he's saying here, even as a Christian, he's saying he finds this thing, the same experience. He finds that he wants to do good, but he can't always do good. Instead, sometimes he does things that are wrong. And he says that's just part of our life. He says, And more importantly, he says, it is not I who am committing this. And that's where the name of this lesson comes from. It wasn't me. And so we see that echoed again in verse 20 down here. And he says, if I did the thing that I did not want, it was not I doing it, but sin that dwelt within me. And I imagine that that's your experience too. Um, you don't want to do those things. Sometimes we say things we didn't want to say. Sometimes we do things we didn't want to do, little rash, quick things, and we regret them right away. And if we look back and think about them, you ask, well, I didn't want to do that. Why did I do that? It really wasn't what I wanted to do, but I did it anyway. And that's what Paul is saying. And so he says that's just part of us. And when you think about that, that kind of leaves us feeling out of control and kind of much out of control. And I remember as a young Christian, when I was learning these things and starting to put them into practice in my life, after I returned after many years, of course. And I found that same thing, and I would sometimes go out with walks and think on walks and think about these things. And I would say, well, how do I know that I'm just not going to be suddenly grabbed up and do something evil? What stops that? And I would walk along, and I would walk up to a car and wonder, well, if I walk by this car, can I know that I'm not just going to reach out and break the mirror off this guy's car? And so it kind of leaves you feeling out of control when you know that there is something that can grab onto you and cause you to do things that you don't want to do. And we see this in society sometimes, this idea that the devil made me do it. We can't use that as an excuse, of course, but yeah, it's not entirely wrong. Paul is saying there is sin that dwells within me, and sometimes that sin that dwells within me reaches out and grabs me and gets me to do things I didn't want to do. So, and now he continues on with that same idea, talking about this sin that is within him, reaching out and grabbing him. And he says, I find, therefore, a law agreeing with my conscience, which wants to do good, because evil is near me. So he's saying there is a law, God's law, that agrees with my conscience, which wants to do good, but evil is near me, and evil is in me, is what he's saying. So in his body there is evil, but his conscience, it wants to do good. And he continues saying, I saw another law in my members, in the members of my body, in the parts of my body, that makes war against the law of my conscience and takes me captive to the law of sin that is in my members. So he's saying there, sometimes this sin that is within us reaches out and grabs us and takes me captive, is the phrase that he uses. And that's not a bad phrase, because it's like that, because afterwards you think, I didn't want to do that. How did I do that? Why did I do that? If I had known this was going to happen, I could have maybe stopped it, but somehow something just grabbed me and I did something I didn't want to do. And so he kind of summarizes his point here by saying, I am a wretched man. I am out of control. There is this thing within me that can grab me sometimes and cause me to do things that I do not want to do. And he asks the question, who will deliver me from this body of death? And so we've seen before, we've talked about the conscience when we were pulling other things out of these verses. The conscience is the same law as the Torah, and so there's really no difference there. And so your conscience is a built-in Torah Bible, if you want to look at it that way. And so it tells us what's right and wrong, and it tells us how to do good. But nonetheless, evil is near me, he says. And so evil is in his body along with his conscience. And so the conscience is part of your body. The law of sin is also in your bodies. And the law of the conscience needs to be close because the law of sin is close. And that's something the Old Testament, the Old Covenant didn't have. The law was written down. It was written on paper, or maybe you had memorized enough of it that you were sort of able to remember it. But putting it into practice was harder than that. And so if you have your conscience working on your side, then that's certainly better than having to memorize and learn and try to put into practice things that are written on paper. And so he says we have a conscience that works with us. It brings us that law of the Torah if we'll listen to that conscience. But it needs to be something that's close to us because the law of sin is close. And from my own experience, that's true. When you're grabbed like this to do things that you didn't want to do, it's despite the fact that your conscience is there to tell you no, you're kind of grabbed already, and it is too late for even the conscience to do anything about that, and you wind up doing things you didn't want to do. So, and Paul talks about this. He says, this body is trying to kill me. It is making every effort to kill me. He calls it the body of death. And so he says, if I let this body rule, it will kill me. So now he kind of puts these two ideas together, these two ideas of different laws. And he talks about being a servant of two masters. And he says, I thank God by our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Now, therefore, I am a servant of the law of God in my conscience, but in my flesh, I am a servant of the law of sin. So he's saying, I'm a servant of two masters. There are two masters in my body. I'm supposed to be in control of me, but I don't feel so in control of me when there's something that can reach out and grab me and get me to do things I didn't want to do. But nonetheless, we are responsible for what we do. And so that might seem a little strange. We feel so out of control when we do things that we didn't want to do, but nonetheless, we are responsible for that. You're responsible for everything that you do. And that might not seem entirely fair. And that's something we try to master as we grow as Christians. We try to become better at catching those situations and keeping the evil in us from grabbing us like that. But nonetheless, sometimes the evil master reaches out and grabs me, Paul says, and does things I don't want to do. And that's just the life we live. It's not a great life that way. It'd be nice if we didn't have that law of sin within our bodies, but that won't come for a period of time yet. And so he isn't really thanking God for this awkward situation of having two masters, one of which can kind of reach out and grab you and get you to do things you didn't want to do. But he thanks God for Yeshua the Messiah, who's provided a way to work around that. And so the workaround is what we'll talk about next. So he says, there is therefore no condemnation to those in Yeshua the Messiah who do not walk in the flesh. For the law of the Spirit of life, which is in Yeshua the Messiah, has freed you from the law of sin and of death. Now, that doesn't mean this evil within you won't reach out and grab you. He says, speaking for himself, that it even grabs him sometimes. And he says, but you are free from that in a different way. You're not free from it happening. You're free from the death that comes from that. And so as I talked about before with the Torah and the Torah law, it would pronounce sin on people. It would say, you did this wrong, you sinned against God, you're separated from God, and therefore death is the punishment for that. And so that was the same for every infraction. You sinned, the result is death, and you're done. And that's all the old law could do. Paul is saying, through Jesus, we are freed from that. We don't have that same experience anymore. That is, we who do not walk in the flesh. And by not walking in the flesh, of course, he means we do not live our lives by the law of the flesh that is in our bodies. The world lives in a different way. The world lives where they sometimes try to do what their conscience says, but they often take opportunities to go and do things that the body of sin, the body of death wants them to do. And they're not so bothered by it as we are. They don't feel so out of control as us. They just think of this was something that they could do, and they did. So if we do not walk in the flesh, he says, we are freed from these things. There is no pronouncement of sin and death against us. And this has changed, something that changes with the Messiah. And so when the sin in our bodies reaches out and grabs us that way, and we say, how did this happen? I didn't want to do that, and I did it anyway. And so with that, we've said, I didn't want to do this. This was not me doing this. And with that, we are forgiven, and the debt is paid because Jesus paid that debt for us. And the forgiveness comes automatically when we recognize what we've done. So that's what Paul is talking about. Is under this new system, the law of sin and death is gone because we are instantly forgiven and the debt is paid and it's done. And these are for the things, of course, that we didn't mean to do. These are the things that we were going along and suddenly the sin in our bodies reached out and got us to do something we didn't mean to do. And so when we've been forgiven and the debt is paid like that, so instantaneously, we just keep on walking in the light. We don't need to worry about those things. They don't need to drag us down. We just keep moving forward. And that's something that is possible for us, but wasn't possible in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, they needed to go and deal with that, and that would be a sacrifice that needed to be made at the temple. So I'm closing up here. Um, Intentional and unintentional, I've talked about so many times, but they're very important things to understand. And this is another one of those cases. Paul's been talking about those times when the sin in our bodies reaches out and grabs us and gets us to do something that we didn't want to do, something evil. And that's entirely unintentional. We weren't planning it, we weren't even thinking about it, and all of a sudden there it is, and it jumps up and grabs us. And so this is an unintentional sin. We didn't plan it at all. It was never part of our intentions. And so that contrasts very much against Hebrews 26, which we've talked about before. And in that one, it talks about willful sin. And it talks about willfully doing what you know to be wrong. And so that's the intentional sin. You knew it was wrong, but you went ahead and did it anyway. And so this is a way to understand in more practical terms what intentional and unintentional is.